Welcome to the webinar series on social inclusion. Today we will be talking about pathways to inclusion in disaster risk management. We're expected to have at least 30 countries online, so we're really excited about that. And just by way of introduction, I wanted to start off by saying my name is Charlotte McLean and Thapo. I'm the Disability Advisor to the World Bank Group. During a disaster emergency, a complex range of social and economic factors affect the ability of individuals to respond. We know that social economic inequalities determine the level of risk that different individuals face, and this often amplifies their vulnerability. What this means is that different populations may experience different types of exposure to the negative effects of any disaster or emergency situation. But in fact, their vulnerability is dependent on their socioeconomic conditions, on civic conditions, on social empowerment, on access to mitigation and relief resources. We will hear today from our featured speaker, Margaret Arnold, a senior social development specialist at the World Bank, about what some of the common experiences of vulnerability are during disasters. She will share with us some common experiences, featuring and highlighting the issue around persons with disabilities, but not exclusively to persons with disabilities. Margaret will talk about how people are left behind or abandoned during evacuations in disasters and conflicts. She'll talk about how people may be separated from each other during conflicts and disasters, and really shine a light on how we can become more inclusive in terms of addressing disaster risk management. So I really appeal to you all to listen closely, to send in questions. We will be having questions after the presentation from Margaret. So enough said from me, and I will hand over to Margaret. Over to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, a very warm greetings to everyone joining us today for this webinar. I'm really happy to be here with you today to share some ideas on why social inclusion is particularly important when we think about managing the risk of natural hazards and climate change. I know, as Charlotte said, we have a lot of different countries online, which is fantastic. And I know that we have a mix of people working more on the disaster risk management side, people working more in the disability space or broader social inclusion space. So we have a nice mix of people. And it also means that some of the concepts I'll be talking about today may be more familiar to some of you on the disaster risk management side or the disability side. But hopefully the messages of the presentation and our discussion will resonate and stay with all of you so that they can be carried forward in your daily lives and in the work that you do. Move the slides. So let's get started with the concept of social inclusion and why it's important to the work of the World Bank. The World Bank has two goals, the twin goals as we refer to them, and they are to end extreme poverty within a generation and to boost shared prosperity, particularly for those living in the bottom 40% of the global economy. And so that means that growth and development should be shared by all and not by a few. So thinking about development, let's consider the few of the facts around persons with disabilities. So they make up 15% of the globe's population. 80% of them live in developing countries, and 80% of them live in abject poverty. So they're often excluded from services. They tend to have lower levels of education attainment and employment. And so we can see persons with disabilities, and the issue of disability is both a cause and a consequence of poverty. So the welfare of people with disabilities is very directly related to the twin goals of the World Bank. Now, what do we mean by social inclusion? Our social development team here at the World Bank, I'm going to hold up a cover of a book that they published a couple of years ago called Inclusion Matters. I highly recommend it. It's really enlightening reading. They offered these two definitions. One is a bit less wordy and simple, so understanding and the process of improving the terms for individuals and groups to take part in society. if we delve a bit deeper, we're looking at improving the ability, opportunity, and dignity of people disadvantaged based on their identity, and that's the key to take part in society. So now it's also important to understand that people have multiple identities. We're not just a woman or a white person or what have you. They're based on gender, religion, ethnicity, disability status, sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. And based on these intersecting identities, you can have cumulative advantages or disadvantages in society. So a nice example they give in the book is from Bolivia, looking at secondary school completion using men and Spanish speaking as a mother tongue as a reference. So if you look just at Bolivia having, I think it's about a 58% completion rate of secondary school education, and if you compare that to a Spanish-speaking man in Bolivia, if you're a Spanish-speaking woman, you have a 5% less chance of completing secondary school. Now, if you don't speak Spanish and you're a Quechua-speaking man, that drops to 14%. So you have a 14% less chance of completing secondary school. And if you're a Quechua-speaking woman, it's a 28% less chance. So when you start to dig deeper, you see how all of these different characteristics of our identities can give people certain advantages or disadvantages in participating in society. And this is certainly not only a developing country issue. I was reading yesterday an example that certainly resonates with me as a woman working and supporting a family in Washington, D.C., that for every dollar a man earns in Washington, D.C., women earn 80 cents. So it affects everyone in different ways. So it's not always about poverty, but oftentimes it is. So when we talk about taking part in society, what are we talking about? We're talking about markets, as I guess just gave the example of labor markets. There's also housing markets, credit, land, and services, as in the example of Bolivia with the education services. Disaster risk management that we're talking about today is an essential service. And spaces, both political spaces, physical spaces, and cultural spaces. So again, looking at people's abilities, the opportunities they're offered, and the dignity that they have to engage in these different spaces. So now, why is all of this important to disaster risk management? You might say that disasters are a natural phenomena and they affect all of us, and that is simply not true. The natural hazard event, the natural phenomena itself, may not discriminate, but what makes it a disaster is, for the most part, socially constructed. So the impacts of natural hazard events and climate change are certainly not neutral, and we also importantly need to recognize that relief efforts, recovery efforts, and reconstruction processes are also not neutral. We've done a number of studies of evaluating recovery processes and the effect of those on poor and marginalized groups, and have found a number of cases where people they're struck by the disaster, and then they could be left even worse off than they were before the disaster event by the recovery process, because they don't have similar access to recovery resources, to information, to compensation, and everything that comes with that. So examples would be, for example, women, in many countries, a lot of their work is in the informal sector. And if the losses that they have, maybe working out of their home, you count that the home is lost, but you don't count the materials or things that they may use if they're working out of their home, those don't get compensated. Or many times women don't have land rights or don't get the deed to the house, so they don't get the adequate help when it comes to rebuilding housing. Think about migrant workers that don't have a very clear legal status. They may be very scared to try and get help after a disaster, and they may just not get any help at all. So there's lots of different examples we can think of, and we need to think about how recovery efforts can reinforce these pre-existing inequities and leave people worse off than they were before the event. So now let's look at some of the particular challenges that persons with disabilities may face in the area of disaster risk management. So on the left-hand column, left-hand side of this chart, you'll see a type of disability. And we've given some examples based on the literature of the particular barriers that people may face. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I'm sure many of you online can add to this. But people with visual disabilities may not, obviously they won't be able to read print warnings or get evacuation or other instructions. They may only have emergency warnings in text forms on a television, and then the difficulties around navigating surroundings, for example, in temporary shelters or temporary housing arrangements. Same goes for people with hearing and speech disabilities around hearing warnings, getting weather information, evacuation and safety instructions, having difficulties communicating with first responders or emergency management personnel. In the physical disabilities area, people may lose their assistive devices if they have a wheelchair or crutches, or any durable medical equipment in the disaster itself and in the response phase. They may not have access to adequate transportation to be evacuated. There are many cases where people with disabilities are more often left behind in disasters, in evacuation situations and in disasters. Accessibility to temporary shelters and temporary housing is an issue. And then on the cognitive and psychological disability side, there may be difficulties in understanding or remembering or following instructions. They may lose contact information and be separated from family members and the important people that get them the help that they need. So there's many different types of barriers we can think about. And in addition to these, just also think back to the facts about people with disabilities on the first slide, right? 80% in developing countries, 80% living in poverty. So, and knowing that, if a group of people is starting with less resources and capacity to absorb the shock of a disaster, they will likely have less access to the resources to recover. So, in addition to these very concrete examples, there's generally the general social marginalization that may make it more difficult for them to recover. So we want to look at what changes need to happen. So what can we do to change this? We always need to look at disasters and risk reduction through a social lens. So starting with the social vulnerability. And that will typically lead you to issues of poverty or power dynamics or access to resources, the voice people have in society, access to justice, all of these social and political issues, right? So the starting with social vulnerability is the key. The hazard is the part that we can control much less. The vulnerability is the part that we can address. So starting with that is important. The second 2 points on this slide are related, in that we need to understand and recognize that most communities are organized, and we need to recognize the experience they have based on their day-to-day living. Particularly poor communities are really expert at managing risk because they're dealing with a myriad of risks on a day-to-day basis and are quite expert at this. And many times we external agencies can go in intervening with all good intentions, but we can be undermining the existing expertise on the ground. So we want to avoid that and understand and strengthen and build upon the skills that people have and the perspective that they have. Now, we also need to recognize that communities are not homogeneous. They're very heterogeneous. There can be exclusion within groups. And so we need to be asking the right questions. We need to be understanding the context and asking the questions around who has less voice, who is vulnerable to what type of impact. And empowering those marginalized groups is a critical ingredient for building resilience. If we ignore them, we're missing out on key expertise and key perspective. If you ask a person with a disability, they can tell you quite simply how a shelter would need to be designed so that they can access it more easily for their particular disability. So asking these questions is critical. And so in general, it's an approach of not treating people as passive beneficiaries. This happens quite often also when we start, keeping people, labeling people as marginalized. We treat them as passive beneficiaries, and we need to treat them as active agents and equal partners in this process. So understanding that and formalizing the role of community is important, and helping them to foster the relationships is between their local and national authorities is key to scaling up these efforts so that we don't stay at a sort of small scale pilot level. And these approaches need to be supported both at the policy level and in our daily practice. So I want to spend a minute just to touch upon the global level policy frameworks to support this change. I don't think the slide is changing. Okay, so let's look at the global policy level, where there's two very key policy frameworks to support disability inclusive disaster risk management. First, there's the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They have Article 11, which I'll just read it very quickly. It just states that all states will take the necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situations of risk, including situations of armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and the occurrence of natural disasters. On the disaster risk management side, we had last year the Hyogo Framework of Action, sorry, not the Hyogo Framework, the Sendai Framework for Action for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was endorsed by parties last March. Now, where its predecessor, the Hyogo Framework that I mentioned, there was no direct mention anyway of persons with disabilities. The Sendai Framework is quite different in that persons with disabilities are mentioned multiple times in the preamble, in the guiding principles, in the priorities for action, in the role for stakeholders. So throughout every section, there's a legitimization, a formalization of the role of persons with disabilities in the design and implementation of disaster risk reduction policies. And that is due to the incredible advocacy efforts of stakeholders representing persons with disabilities in the lead up to and during the Sendai meeting last year. And I know a number of you are online, so it's really a great accomplishment. Now, I'd like to spend a minute or two on looking at how we put those policies into practice. So just looking at the disaster risk management components, the disaster risk management area can be broken down and understood in several ways. The one I have here on this slide is the way the World Bank conceptualizes it. It can be further simplified into 3 key steps, which for those of you that may not come from the disaster risk management field are just understanding, so assessing your risk, understanding the risk that you're facing, the second step of doing something about that to reduce the risk, and then being cognizant that we cannot eliminate all the risks. There will be some residual risks that we have to deal with, taking steps either through insurance, recovery planning, preparedness, so all the steps you need to take to prepare and be able to recover if an event happens. So now this 5 components that the bank uses are a bit more nuanced because we work in these different spaces. So if you look at the first pillar of risk identification, there's some suggestions, again, not an exhaustive list, of what can be done to include persons with disabilities. So certainly when we're assessing risk, including persons with disabilities in those assessments capacity, of vulnerability, so that we understand the risk and the needs that they have. In the risk reduction side, making sure that we follow accessible infrastructure design standards, universal design practices to the greatest extent possible so that people have accessibility, and using accessible signage such as braille or large print for people with visual disabilities to know what to do in an emergency. On the preparedness side, persons with disabilities are often left out of preparedness plans. And so they are just left out of the process when people are preparing for disaster. So we can include them in accessible maps, accessible evacuation routes, training personnel, and having accessible transportation to make sure they're included in evacuation efforts. And having their families also participate and having persons with disabilities participate in evacuation drills so that they're included in the process. On the financial protection side, this is where insurance and safety nets and social protection mechanisms come in. They can be targeted specifically for persons with disabilities and make sure that there's funds to cover assistive devices or medical equipment that they may need. And certainly on the reconstruction side, making sure that there's physical accessibility of shelters and facilities and whatever infrastructure is reconstructed. It was after the 2004 tsunami in Aceh that Bill Clinton, who was then special envoy for the reconstruction, coined this phrase, "Build Back Better." And I think that tends to be taken as build back physically better, but we also need to think of it in a broader sense of the term in building society back better. We can take these tragedies and make sure that whatever we do going forward, that we are more inclusive, both in our physical infrastructure that we build and in how we treat people. So this is my last slide before we open up for the discussion. I just want to talk a little bit about what this looks like on the ground. I won't go into all of these examples because I know that we have, for example, from the Indonesia example, we have people from ASB on the line, hopefully. I know they were registered, so maybe someone from that organization can speak better to that example. I'm just going to talk to you about a couple of these that I've been more closer to or that I'm more familiar with. So in Ecuador, for example, Ecuador has done some really impressive things to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. And one project that the CETEDIS, which is the Technical Secretariat for Inclusive Management of Disabilities, were addressing the fact that a survey had been taken and persons with disabilities were reporting that they were never consulted or included in these contingency plans. So they were trying to address that. So they undertook a project in 5 provinces where they geo-referenced hundreds of people, about 600 people with disabilities at their homes. They helped those families develop inclusive contingency plans around what to do in an emergency. A number of the sectors in those provinces developed institutional inclusive contingency plans. They did inclusive simulations to make sure to reach out and make sure persons with disabilities were included in those, trained humanitarian workers in sign language so that they could communicate to people with hearing disabilities. So they took a number of steps to make sure that at every step along the way that persons with disabilities were included. Another example I want to talk to you about comes from Japan, and this is focused mainly on elderly people in the community in the north of Japan that was hit by the Great Eastern Japan earthquake and tsunami in Ofunato. And this is where elders did not want to be treated as a vulnerable group to be taken care of. They wanted to do something to help the community recover. So there was an NGO called Ibasho that helped them and the whole community. They took about a year to facilitate community workshops and talked about what they wanted to do. And what they ended up doing was building a cafe. So it functions as a business, it's a nonprofit business. But the cafe serves as a community center. Um, it's run completely by the elders of the community, and they took a part in building it as well. They in the house where it is was an old farmhouse that one of the persons from the community had donated, and it was an old house, and even the restoration of that house, only carpenters that were 75 years and older knew how to rebuild the house according to the techniques that that the original architecture had. So they had a part in designing it every step of the way. They run the cafe, and it really serves to be. It's been operating for about 3 years now. They serve food to the community. It's like a coffee shop. Young mothers go and they can get child care for their children while they have a cup of tea. They give classes and teaching the younger parents and the youth in the community about traditional cooking. So they're giving classes, they're learning about culture. And they're also doing things. They started an organic garden so that they have a farmer's market on the weekends. So it's a business, but it also functions to rebuild the social capital and the social networks that were devastated during the emergency. And this project is being replicated in Philippines and Nepal now. And in Nepal, it's being expanded to include persons with disabilities, and women in particular. So those are some good examples, and I'm sure we have more online. So why don't we open up the discussion?
Great. Thank you very much, Margaret. So you just mentioned at the tail end of your presentation the Nepal project that includes women. And one of the questions from the audience was how can we better include women with disabilities in the process of disaster risk management?
So this is one of my favorite topics because it's something I've worked on quite a lot. And just the other day, I was talking to one of the leaders of a grassroots women's network that I work with, and she said, well, something I mentioned in the presentation, which was when you put people in this marginalized box, you treat them as passive recipients of benefits and beneficiaries. But in fact, many of these groups, particularly women, are at the forefront of designing and building resilience at a broader community level. And there are many, many examples of this. I have found in my experience working on a lot of post-disaster reconstruction that when these events happen, women get organized. And because of their role in the household and their role in the community, they know who is vulnerable to what. They know who needs what. So there's a lot of evidence demonstrating that if you distribute relief supplies through women, it's distributed more effectively. People get what they need. And also lots of instances where examples of empowering women in the relief and the immediate post-disaster context can have nice developmental ripple effects. So in Honduras, after Hurricane Mitch, Garifuna women organized around getting people the relief supplies that they needed, and that blossomed into a community development organization that functions to this day, where they started seed banks, they were preserving indigenous seeds, or tool banks. So they're doing a lot of activities that have broader resilience strengthening effects. So there's a lot of ways to empower women very easily, and we have lots of documentation and evidence on this.
Great. The other question that we had comes from Ghana. And the question is, what kind of advice would you provide to the government of Ghana and its citizens, given the floods and the continuous floods that Ghana has experienced?
So actually in Ghana, I know a World Bank team has visited recently to Accra around looking at that city's ability to, looking at the hazards that they're facing and looking at their ability to manage risk. Um, and again, that has to be looked at from all sides, no? The sort of physical infrastructure and how the development patterns are increasing that risk or decreasing that risk. And from the social side of how people um, can mobilize around reducing the risk in their own communities and working with the local authorities around strengthening that risk. So, um, you know, it's basically, again, taking these basic steps of assessing what the situation is and then identifying with affected communities what are the steps, the practical steps that can be taken to reduce and manage that risk.
So another practical question we have from the audience is, how would we handle disability immediately after an earthquake?
Well, again, I think we have to think about before the earthquake and the preparedness side. So in the immediate phase, if people are included in evacuation plans, in emergency and first responder plans, communities themselves are always the first responders. It will always take some time to get help from municipal or national authorities. So communities themselves need to be prepared and have contingency plans about, again, knowing where people with disabilities are, the type of help that they need, so that they can respond. But again, it's really about thinking about these things before the event strikes.
So if I may just add an example to particularly to an earthquake situation, is Pakistan. So after the earthquake in Pakistan, the World Bank had had various interventions, and the approach taken from the disability perspective was to really take on a twin track approach, to mainstream disability into the overall interventions that were taking place at the time, but also to look at specific needs that were emerging for persons with disabilities. Because as Margaret pointed out in her presentation, disasters are both a cause and a consequence or disability is both a cause and a consequence of disaster. And in the case of Pakistan, we had a surge in terms of the numbers of people who had become disabled. And so there was an immediate need to ensure that we were able to provide assistive devices, to make sure that people had access to rehabilitation, that people had access to transportation, but then also to make sure that beyond that, we were building back better, as Margaret pointed out, but also ensuring that there were sufficient resources to provide for the inclusion of persons with disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you were telling that the example of Haiti, was it, where there were 60,000 people who became disabled because of the earthquake. Earthquakes in particular, with buildings coming down, can create a lot of disability. So it's important to be cognizant of that in preparation plans, right? And again, as Charlotte said, to have immediate access to the assistive devices or equipment that people may need to address that.
And I think a lesson learned certainly from our perspective in Pakistan was that it could not be a one-size-fits-all. So what we saw there was that there was a lot of goodwill coming in and a lot of wheelchairs being donated, but those wheelchairs were not the appropriate wheelchairs to fit the terrain of where the disaster had taken place. And so, again, back to one of the points that Margaret raised, this is why it is absolutely imperative that we do have the participation of persons with disabilities in these processes, because they're able to tell you that that is not going to work. And there was an interesting anecdote that came out of that process was, people were saying, at this point in time, we don't need wheelchairs. We need donkeys, because donkeys can take us and our remaining household from point A to point B, given the terrain. So I think the inclusion of all groups is really important, notwithstanding the absolute need to upstream ensure that inclusion is already part of the plan. We've had a couple of suggestions for future webinars, and we'll take those into consideration. Thank you very much. Margaret, there was a question that says, how can disaster risk reduction be actually managed? How can we manage it?
Manage disaster risk reduction?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understand the question. It's again, taking the steps. You have to start with understanding what the risk is, and then you can identify what you can do about it. And this needs to involve everyone in society. It's not an issue just for Ministry of Civil Protection. It's not an issue just for the Ministry of Social Welfare. It's an issue for everyone. It really touches upon every sector. In education, we need, in a highly disaster-prone country, you need children. Part of the curriculum needs to include what to do in case of a disaster. What can you do in your home to prevent risk and reduce risk? What to do, what to do to respond to specific different hazard events. So in every single sector, we need to have this in mind when we're thinking about disasters.
So another important question that's coming up from the audience is the issue around data and the lack thereof. Many of these groups that are disproportionately disadvantaged, we don't have data on. So any thoughts, any kind of good practices around how we might use these opportunities to collect better data? Your thoughts, Margaret?
So, once again, it's hard to always do these things right after a disaster. So getting good baselines prior to events. In the World Bank, we're working with a lot of governments through census data and what have you, through social protection systems to identify, there's poverty maps you can do. So you can look at what poverty maps exist and overlay those with hazard risk maps and see who's going to be more vulnerable to what in a disaster. So again, this is not something to do right in an emergency, but even in an emergency, if you don't have that data, you can collect some information. We typically do what's called a post-disaster needs assessment right after a large disaster. And in that process, better data needs to be collected. It's not standard operating procedure, for example, to get disaggregated data according to gender or according to disability status. So this needs to be standard operating procedure. So and oftentimes there's some census data or something that we can tap into to get at least an idea of a baseline of different socioeconomic vulnerabilities.
So another interesting question. Different countries perceive natural disasters differently. If a country sees a disaster as inevitable, they're less likely to address disaster preparation. How does communities' perception of persons with disabilities impact disaster preparedness and response, and how can these perceptions be influenced?
So natural disasters are often called acts of God, right? And that is, in my view, it's just completely false. Again, the hazard event is a natural phenomenon. We live on a planet that is seismically active. The plates are always shifting. We're going to have floods and droughts and all kinds of events, volcanoes. Now, when we're talking about climate change, we are starting to get into the space where human activity is actually increasing the frequency of extreme events. So climate change mitigation is about reducing that, right, or controlling that. But regardless of that, the vulnerability that we build is what makes it a disaster. We can have a hazard event. I mean, I'll give an extreme example. If an earthquake happens in the middle of a desert where no one lives, it's not a disaster. It's just an earthquake. It's just some seismic activity. In the Gujarat earthquake of 2001, there was, I think, about 15,000 people killed. Around that same day, there was an earthquake in Seattle, in Washington state, in the United States. No one was killed in that. So it really is about how we build, where we build, how we organize ourselves, and how we prepare for these natural phenomena that we live with. Um, so that needs to be addressed.
So, very interesting question. You mentioned in your presentation, Margaret, building back better. And one of our participants notes that much of the funding that comes to Build Back Better comes from international donors, and the World Bank. And the person is asking, is there any way that we can put more pressure on ourselves to make sure that we are incorporating accessibility features into the Building Back Better process?
Yeah. So the short answer, I think, is yes, and that's your job, the World Bank. But absolutely, I mean the resources that, for example, the World Bank provides to the countries that we work with um, comes with technical assistance and guidance, right? So we can help to guide that, and we need to do better as an institution in encouraging inclusion in every way in the reconstruction process. So we're working to build awareness of our own staff and the governments that we work with on these issues. I think some countries have different levels of awareness, but I think absolutely we should be going in that direction.
And I think the interesting point related to that is that often after a disaster, we then we discover it unearths a lot of issues. So in some places, we have found out that, in fact, countries did not or do not have building codes. So this is, again, it's an opportunity to build back better. But I think really underlying Margaret's point that building back better is not just about the physical environment. It's about using it as an opportunity to look at what the regulatory framework is. If you do have a building code, is that building code enforced? Are there people trained? Are architects being trained in terms of how to build back better? So it's much more than just putting the pressure on for the accessibility, but really making it a seamless aspect of development.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in the informal sector, there's a lot of we would call non-engineered structures, right? Just local things that local people build, and they can also be trained and made aware of safer practices that they can use.
So there's a comment that notes that there are a lot of nice policies, guidelines on mainstreaming disability development initiatives to include disability. And the person online feels that we're not really succeeding in translating this into practice, and attributes that to the lack of political will, the lack of understanding of disability, and the lack of understanding, the lack of clarity that disability is a poverty reduction issue, and the belief that persons with disabilities are expensive to include in development. What can we do about this?
Well, I think we can keep on keeping on with what we've been doing. I mean, if you look at the change from, as I mentioned, the Hyogo framework to the Sendai framework, that was completely due to the lobbying, advocacy, and all of the evidence gathering from groups dealing with persons with disabilities. I mean, that was an important change. The work that the World Bank is doing on social inclusion, this is becoming a part of everything that we do, trying to integrate this into development efforts. It's so it's not just about economic development or economic growth. It's about, again, it's part of our twin goals, right? Making that growth shared by everyone. So political will certainly helps, and we need to do what we can to build that. I mean, if you look at the case of Ecuador, it was their former vice presidents, I think, that has really championed a lot of these issues, and that has made a difference. So, finding these champions and nurturing these champions can help quite a bit, I think.
And I do think that we do have some really important frameworks to guide us in that respect. I think Margaret mentioned the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and in particular Article 11, that speaks to humanitarian assistance, is really important. And I think, the convention is not just a nice policy, it's a legally binding document that requires state parties to actually implement that. So I think that, we have certainly made steps in terms of beginning to translate the policies into practice. That there is a long way to go, yes, absolutely. But I think that we need to collectively think about it as our responsibility to make sure that we are providing better capacity, training those that we work with so that they understand why disaster risk reduction management is important for disability and vice versa. So trying to make those inroads and those entry points at every point would be really important.
Yeah, and building more evidence too. I mean, we only mentioned a few examples in the presentation, but there's probably much more out there. Sharing those because I think many times a municipal government or national government is not opposed to being socially inclusive, but they don't know how to do it. So when you see what it looks like, and you can see how easy it is, and in some cases, that it's not you're not adding a lot in terms of cost either. I mean, these are things that can easily be done.
Yes, and thank you for raising the cost issue, Margaret, because I think that that's often something that is raised by our clients, that including persons with disabilities, including other groups, is going to be a huge expense. In your experience, what has that been?
Well, I can give experience from the issue of gender and including women, for example. I don't have off the top of my head specific examples around persons with disabilities, but the famous example is Bangladesh in building their cyclone shelters, because you had when Cyclone Gorky hit in the early 90s, I believe, there were 300,000 people killed by the cyclone, and for every 15 people that died, 14 of those were women. And so that's a huge ratio. So from there on, the government invested heavily in cyclone shelters, but they also took a look at why so many more women were dying, and found that it was social mores, cultural norms that prevented them from leaving the house when they got a warning, or women aren't taught to swim. They're taught to swim less often. The traditional dress may have inhibited them running, but they didn't feel safe going to a cyclone shelter, or they had to stay behind to take care of either a person with a disability or an elder person or a child that had mobility issues. So they didn't feel safe. So when they built those cyclone shelters, they made sure to build separate safe spaces for women, and they also invested in training women as the deliverer of the evacuation message. So when they went around on a moto with a bullhorn to tell people a cyclone was coming, please go to the shelter, when women heard another woman's voice coming out of the bullhorn, they felt safe going there. So that had a huge difference, and these were things that cost little to no money. And so when Cyclone Sidr hit a number of years later, the ratio dropped from 14-1 to 4-1, I believe. It also dropped huge. It also saved thousands of lives, because there were 3,000 people killed in Cyclone Sidr, which is still tragic, but down from 300,000, and the ratio dropped of women dying to men tremendously. So those are things that did not cost a lot of money at all. It's just having that awareness and integrating those changes into the design of what you're going to do.
Great. So in many ways, I think that kind of draws us to a close. I want to thank you all for being really very active participants in this webinar. And just to point out some key issues that I think Margaret raised without trying to repeat her entire presentation. I think the main message was that inclusive DRM is good for all. So it's not just about including persons with disabilities. It's about including older persons. It's about including women. It's about including children. It really is just good practice. On the point of good practice, I think the issue is also how do we better collect good practices around the inclusion of these groups that are typically marginalized. The issue around better data collection, I think, remains an important one. I can't stress the importance that you also stressed around ensuring that there is preparedness before the disaster. So that process needs to happen in an inclusive manner, because I think typically we see people being included post-disaster instead of, pre-disaster. So that really is important. And then, ensuring that there's information and that people have access to information. And in addressing the issue of information, also thinking about the absolute essential need to have accessible information, whether that's ICT or not, but making sure that that's accessible. So those would be some of the issues that I would like to highlight. And again, thank you all for participating. Please provide feedback immediately after if you can, because we would like to continue to make these webinars better and more useful to you. So once again, thank you very much. And thank you, Margaret, for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.